mic.
Okay, good evening. We're at Streetlight Ministries. This is actually, we had some technical difficulties on Monday, so we were not able to go live. It's now 4:30 on Wednesday, and this is our Monday discussion. So we're going to get started, and we'll pray first. And there's some interesting things I think we want to discuss today. So anyway, we'll get started now. Heavenly Father, we glorify you and we thank you that you have given so much to us. You gave us your Son. You gave us everything. And we pray, Lord, that we will never take that for granted, and that we will seek you and search you for until the return of Jesus, which is coming, I'm sure, very soon. But we glorify you in all that we do, and give us the patience, the strength, and the wisdom in your precious name. Amen. Okay, we're going to get started, and it's going to be a little bit of a different topic. I know we're on Ezekiel, chapter 40, 46, 47, and 48, maybe part of 45 also. But there's interesting things that I really wanted to talk about, because there are things in that, you know, we were all taught things growing up as children in church. If you grew up in a church, we were taught and as adults, and some of those things, you know, may not be biblically accurate. So if we take the Bible literally, it answers a lot of questions that I get questions all the time of why something happened, but what they were taught was not really the way it's written. So some of those things, I mean, Genesis chapter 3, verse 14 through 16, it says, Adonai Elohim said to the serpent, because you did this, cursed are you above all the livestock and above every animal in the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust will you eat all the days of your life. I will put animosity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He will crush your head, and you shall crush his heel. To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pain from conception to labor. I will, in pain will you give birth to the children. Your desire will be towards your husband, yet he must rule over you, because she initiated the original sin. But that's not the point of what I put that up there for. I have a lot of people ask me, well, where did all these children come? Everyone thinks that Cain and Abel were the first children born outside the garden. It never says that anywhere. But people make assumptions because they don't really see. I mean, I'm talking about pastors now, make assumptions because they weren't taught what really. And I've discussed this with so many pastors, and they said, man, I went through 4 years of seminary, 4 years of pre-seminary. I never saw this. I've read it 100 times, but I've never seen it. I can't, because people tell me all the time that they read right through something because they were taught it the wrong way, and so every time they read it, they still think they don't even see the truth. Because in this case, Adam and Eve had many, many children in the garden long before sin occurred. The first child mentioned to be born outside the garden is Seth, when Adam was 120 years old. So these children, I've done math just conservatively using math. One child, I mean, these would have been perfect births and perfect conceptions. Who knows if they had twins, triplets, quadruplets, but just assuming they had single children, they could have had as many as 15,000 children before the sin. Or more, many more. So those children, and that's why God said to Cain, you shall be cursed, and I will send you out and wandering the wilderness. And he said, yeah, but all the people I run into in the cities will want to kill me. And God put a mark on his forehead, if you read scripture. Well, where did those people come from? They were his brothers, his sisters, his nieces, his nephews, his relatives from in the garden. Created their own cities. So anyway, I just wanted to show that as a point. But in that case, it says that I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He will crush your head, and you shall crush his heel. Now, if I go to 1 Samuel 17, I mean, that is literal. That is actually one of the first prophecies, probably the second prophecy. The first one was that the day you eat this, you shall surely die. The second one would be more than likely this one. And when they put enmity between the seed of the woman, which is Jesus, and the seed of Satan, which is the Nephilim, and Goliath was a Nephilim, and this is what this particular passage is talking about. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents, and David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. But he put his armor in his tent, and his shield, all of that. What would David bring Goliath's head to Jerusalem for? Because at that time the Jebusites were in captivity of the city of Jerusalem, and David knew that one day he was going to take over that city for God. And he went there with that head and said, "This is the greatest enemy in the land, and I killed him." So he is telling, he's taking the head to Jerusalem, and he's showing them, brandishing the fact that I took him out, I'll take you out too. And eventually did in a short order. But once he did that, the custom of the Jewish people of that day would have been, they would have buried that skull on the highest point in Jerusalem for a reminder to every enemy that passed by through the Jezreel Valley or on the other side to the west of Jerusalem. Anyone would have seen the marker that would have been placed there to represent Goliath, where his skull was buried. Now, where do we get that from? Matthew 27, verse 33. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, the place of a skull. Many translations say the place of the skull. What skull? It doesn't say that it looks like a skull, but yet every time I hear anybody talk about it, they go to the Holy Land, or they always want to show a mountain that looks like it's got recessed eyes and nose, and it looks like a skull. That's not what it says. It's the place of a skull or the skull. What skull? Goliath, the one that David brought. Why is that important? Because what was actually happening is when Jesus is being crucified, they actually would crucify them with we think of them. We see all the pictures with the Jesus and the two thieves with their feet 6 feet up off the ground. But really, they crucified them as close to the ground as they could, maybe only a foot or two above the dirt. And if we look at the way that they were actually crucified, because now they've unearthed many old, ancient crucifixions, because obviously there was only about a 200-year period where they crucified people, and that was the 200 years around Jesus' birth and obviously crucifixion. But now that they're unearthing them, they actually show, and I'm going to have to use this for balance, but they actually would put their feet on the side of the cross or the side of a tree, and they would put the spike through their heel on each side. So each heel would have a spike going through it. Now, what did we see about? It says, I will put enmity between your seed and her seed, and he will crush your heel. That happened at the crucifixion. The spikes were driven through the heel. And you will crush his head. How is that? Well, Jesus' feet being pierced through the heel are a foot or two above the skull of Goliath. And he is crushing through his forgiveness of sin and taking on our sin Okay, Ezekiel 44, 18 through 31. I just put a brief thing up there. Those are rules regarding the priesthood. We have discussed the rules over the past few weeks of the priesthood, and I don't think we need to dredge that up again. Ezekiel 45, verses 1 through 17. It's the laws of laying out the allocation of the land for the Levites. How will they distribute the land? Because they don't have a territory. Their land is just around the Temple Mount area. Verses 18 through 25, those are the offerings for Moedim, which the first time, I don't know if I put that up there. No. First time we see Moedim is in Genesis 1. I think it's verse 16, where it talks about the reasons that God created the sun and the moon. And the reason he created the sun and the moon was to separate day and night. We know that. And then it says to put signs in the heavens, because you look at how many times in the Bible God used sign. You know, the wise men followed signs in the heavens, but there were also signs to Hezekiah in the heavens. There were signs to Joshua in the heavens. He used the sun and the moon to portray, and still is today, using them for signs. Look at the four blood moons that we had about 5 years ago, and there were two. They're all on Passover and Sukkot, 2 years or a year apart, and in the middle was a solar eclipse. Now the solar eclipse, the sun is a sign to the Gentiles, the moon is a sign to the Jew. Now if you look at the final blood moon of those four, was the moon was at perfect perigee, which means perigee means it's the time at which, and it's all of its cycles combined, it is that time when it's the closest to Earth. And if you, I don't know if you've ever seen pictures, but you can look them up online. And the moon was at perigee over Jerusalem, which is not a coincidence. And I've seen the pictures, and it was so close that it just looked massive in the sky. It's so impressive. But Moedim means God's appointed times, which are the 7 feast days. 7 feast days are not Jewish feast days. They're God's feast days. So he gave them to the Jewish people because they were his people. If we're going to become part of his people, the feast days should mean something to us too. Ezekiel 46, verses 1 through 3, the celebration of Shabbat, which Shabbat, when you put the OT on the end, it just means plural. So it's talking about ongoing Shabbats. And the new moon festivals, which is the Moedim, which is the God's appointed time, in front of the east gate. Ezekiel 46, verses 4 through 15, the rules for sacrifices for the Moedim, the feast days, because those are critical. I mean, you look at, we think that I don't know why people say, well, they use so much allegorical stuff in the New Testament. And I said, are you kidding me? In the Old Testament, he was so literal that when Aaron's 2 sons lit a sacrifice with a fire from the wrong pit, from the wrong altar, God struck them dead in their footsteps. Now, if everything was so incredibly accurate in the Old Testament, why would the New Testament be any different? I don't know why it would be. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And I know Jesus came and fulfilled the old covenant, but that doesn't mean what at least what I was always taught, that covenant, that means that covenant passed away. No, that covenant didn't pass away. Jesus had to come fulfill it, because he is the only one that could. Before we can move on to the new covenant, someone had to fulfill the old covenant, and that had to be Jesus. He's the only one that could. So, and he didn't say, when people tell me that, and many pastors have said the old covenant passed away, and I said, really? So it's okay to commit adultery, it's okay to commit murder, it's okay to steal, it's okay to lie, it's okay to, and they say, well, no. And I said, well, that's the old covenant. So how can you tell me it passed away, but yet I can't do it? So if I'm gonna, what he said was, I want you to change the focus. The focus is now on love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And if you do that, you won't do those things. You won't do those. You won't commit adultery because you'll love your wife as you love yourself. You won't steal from your neighbor because you love him as you love yourself. You won't worship other gods because you love God above yourself. So it's the old covenant did not pass away. It was made easier to follow. Genesis 1:14 through 16. Then God said, and this is what we were just talking about. Let lights in the expanse or of the sky be for separating the day from the night. They will be signs and for seasons and for days and years. They will be for lights in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth. And it happened so. Then God made the two great lights, the greater light for dominion over the day and the lesser light over the stars of the dominion of the night. And this right here where it says the signs and for seasons, that seasons is a very poor that word is moedim. And moedim has a specific meaning, and I don't know why we as Gentiles translated it as seasons, because that's not what it says. The moedim, I can see where I guess they could have gotten it, because the moedim starts with new moon festivals, and it kind of depicts the breakup of winter or the breakup of, but it falls in that time frame. One is around spring, and then the other is in the fall. But that's not what the word Moedim means. That means that on that time, in that season, on that day, specifically on a specific day, the first of Tishri is for the fall, and the first of Nisan is for the spring. On those days, you start the feast season of the spring and the feast season of the fall. And you count from that day exactly how many days between each feast day. So it's not an allegorical statement. Ezekiel 46 verse 17, but if he gives of his inheritance as a gift to one of his servants, it will be his until the year of liberty, when it will revert to the prince. His inheritance will belong to his sons. The prince must not take from the people's inheritance, evicting them wrongfully out of their property. He must give inheritance to his sons out of his property, so that the people will be displaced, anyone from his own property. Now, I need to reiterate that these things that we're talking about, this is during the Millennial Reign. It applies still in the Old Testament. It applies today in Israel. But this specifically is talking about the renewal of it during the Millennial Reign. Now, what is he talking about when he says it will be his until the year of liberty? Now, if you're familiar with Judaism and Jewish customs that God gave the Jewish people, that every 50th year is a Jubilee cycle. Every 7th year is a Shemitah. 7 Shemitahs equals a Jubilee. So that year of liberty is the year of Jubilee, when this was designed so that the Jews would always own the land of it that God had ordained for the children of Jacob. They might sell it in harsh times. They might do something to displace their family from the land. But at the year of the Jubilee, and it doesn't matter if you sold it to someone on the 45th year of the last Jubilee cycle, in 5 years, when it becomes the 50th year again, that land must go back to the original owner, because it was designed to keep Israel in ownership of all the land of Israel. That's what it was designed to do. Ezekiel 46 verses 19 through 24, rules for the sacrifices at the western gate, which are where the sin offerings are to be boiled. Each of these gates had their own specific purpose. As we talked about last time, there were four main gates. There's a lot of gates, but the four main gates are the north, the south, the east, and the west. But then there's the sheep gate. Then there's all kinds of gates. But they were not. They were specific for a purpose, and people were not allowed to enter or exit through them. Ezekiel 47. this is where, to me, it gets interesting. This is a sure sign of how close we are to the millennial reign. Then he brought me back to the door of the house. Behold, water was flowing out from under the threshold of the house eastward. Now, bear in mind that if you remember in Ezekiel 43, we saw Jesus walk in through the eastern gate, and he walked into the temple that's going to be built very soon, probably during the very first part of the tribulation, maybe before. But when he sits on the throne, it says that the water gushes out and it flows to the east. It also goes to the west towards the Mediterranean. But the one that's of great interest is to the east, because if you look at when Ezekiel is describing it, it says he walks 1,000 cubits to the east, and it's a trickling creek. But he gets out 1,000 cubits, and he said it's up to his knees. And then he goes another 1,000 cubits, and it's up to his waist. And he goes another 1,000 cubits, and it's now a rushing, raging river, and that no man can cross. And it actually dumps into the north end of the Dead Sea and refreshes it. It says that the south end of the Dead Sea remains a salt. It doesn't use the word south. It uses that the other portion shall remain a salt marsh. And I tried to find as good a pictures as I can, and we'll get to them in a minute. When the man went out eastward with a line in his hand, he measured 1,000 cubits. Then he led me to the water to my ankles, and again he measured 1,000, led me to the water up to my knees. Again he measured 1,000, and it led me into the water up to my waist. We just discussed this. Again he measured 1,000, and now it was a raging river that I could not pass through, for the water had risen, water to swim in, a river that could not be crossed. He said to me, have you seen this, son of man? Then he brought me back to the bank of the river. When I had returned, behold, there were very many trees on one side and on the other, along the bank of the river. Then he said to me, these waters go out toward the eastern region. They go down to the Arabah. Arabah in Hebrew means desert, and enter the sea. When they arrive at the sea, the waters of the sea will flow and become fresh. This is what we had just talked about. It's being purified by Jesus being on the throne. And it will be that every living creature that swims will live wherever the river goes. There will be a very great multitude of fish, because this water goes there and makes the salt water fresh. So everything will be healed and live wherever the river goes. I think this is really interesting because I tried. This is what the south end looks like. All of the calcium and all the minerals. There's supposedly what is it, $16 trillion worth of rare earth metals and things in the dead, and they are mining them. And Israel's making a lot of money on mining those things out of the Dead Sea. And as you know, nothing can live in there. But things are happening. There are little springs that are popping up around the Dead Sea, and for some reason they have fish in them. They are being prepared for when Jesus puts his 2 feet on the throne room in the new temple, and the water becomes fresh, and those what it says is that every fish found in the Mediterranean Sea will live in the north end of the Dead Sea. Now here is what we're looking at, the portion of the Dead Sea, and then this, because I don't know if you've seen it in the news or heard anybody talk about it, Israel's talking about the fact that the water is receding so rapidly from the Dead Sea that they are trying to come up with a way to run, I think it's 177 miles from the Red Sea, where Moses crossed, run a trench all the way up here to refill the Dead Sea. And I don't think that's going to happen, because I think Jesus is going to do it himself. But this little thing here is the only portion, in this one over here, the only portions of water that is now moving from the north end of the sea to the south end. Almost all of it is being cordoned off to where there's a North Dead Sea and a South Dead Sea, just as what Ezekiel prophesied, that one end of the Dead Sea will become fresh and the other end will become a salt marsh. That can only happen if they're separated, and that separation is occurring right now. You can see this is this is the north end of the Dead Sea, and if you come towards the camera, on the other side of this barrier that is now being exposed because the water is receding, over here is the south end, which is a salt marsh. Ezekiel 47, it says, verse 10, fishermen will stand by it from En-gedi to En-gleen. It will be a place for spreading of nets. Their fish will be of many different kinds, like the fish of the great sea, a huge quantity. Its swamps and marshes will become fresh. They will be set aside for the salt. On the river, on its banks, on the side and that side, on this side and that side, will grow every kind of tree for food. Its leaf will not wither, its fruit will not fail. It will bear new fruit every month, because its water flows from the sanctuary where Jesus sits. Its fruit will be for food, and its leaf will be for healing. I think that's interesting, healing. It's kind of almost like a bunch of tree of life trees. So, but all of this is projected to happen during the Millennial Reign. Now, to me, this is so exciting, because if you're a follower of Jesus, and he says we will come and rule and reign with him during the Millennial Reign. Now, that doesn't mean that we'll all be in Israel, because there'll be populations all over the world. Zechariah talks about the fact that that the kings of the earth and the people of the earth during the Millennial Reign must travel to Jerusalem on Sukkot, which is the Feast of Tabernacles, which is the celebration of God with us, Emmanuel, to worship before Jesus in Jerusalem. And Zechariah wrote, obviously it's God telling him what to write, but Zechariah wrote that anyone who doesn't come, if certain areas of the world are not represented, then those people, that Jesus will withhold rain from that nation for a whole year. So these are the times we're about to enter into, and I don't know if that's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. But I can tell you it's not long. Thus says Adonai Elohim, this will be the border by which you will divide the land for the inheritance, according to the 12 tribes of Israel, Joseph receiving 2 portions. You will inherit it, each one like another. As I lifted my hand to give to the fathers, so this land will fall to you as an inheritance. And what he's talking about here, Joseph is being divided. If you look in the book of Revelation, chapter 7, I believe it is, where it talks about the 12 tribes, you will see a tribe listed for Joseph and one listed for Manasseh. I think Ephraim is out of the picture at that point. But I think that Revelation 7 with all of the 12 tribes, it's very telling. And we're going to talk about that in a minute too. This will be the boundary of the land on the north side from the Great Sea by way of Hethlon, to the entrance of Zedad, Hamath, Berotha, Sibraim, which is between the border of Damascus and the border of Hamath, as far as Hazer Hedekon, which is on the border of Huron. So the border from the sea will be Hazer Enan at the border of Damascus, with the territory of Hamath to the north. This will be the northern side. Now, bear in mind, in Isaiah 17, before all of this happens, and there's a lot of references to Damascus here, but Damascus will be destroyed. Isaiah 17 says, in the evening time trouble, in the morning Damascus is no more. And it's funny because the former Prime Minister of Iran, Ahmadinejad, and the current Prime Minister made himself basically king of Turkey, have both said that if Israel attacks Iran, and they will, Persia, that's Jeremiah 49. If they do that, then Damascus and Lebanon will dump 75,000 missiles onto Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And when Netanyahu was still president of Israel, he said, if you do that, we will wipe out Israel overnight. And I don't know. Netanyahu, I do believe Netanyahu is probably a Messianic Jewish person, and I believe he probably knew what he was saying. But when he says that, he is quoting he is quoting Isaiah 17. I don't know if he knows it or not. But my wife and I were watching the news, and this was probably 4 or 5 years ago. And I said, shoot, I can tell you the scripture verses that the last 5 stories on the news came from, because they were all almost word for word what was going on, whether it be wiping out Damascus, whether it's Jeremiah 49 that Israel will attack Elam at the foremost of its strength. Elam is the southwest portion of Iran, which is where Daniel wrote half the book of Daniel. And it happens to be where all of the nuclear sites in Iran they're in the ancient territory of Elam. And Jeremiah wrote what God told him to write, which is that at some point Israel will attack Elam at the foremost of its strength. Now, other than a nuclear weapon, I don't know what more you could say is a foremost of your strength. And thanks to 2 of our last 3 administrations, Iran is extremely close to a nuclear weapon, closer than any news person will tell you. Still in Ezekiel 47, verses 18, the east side between Haran, Damascus, Gilead, and the land of Israel will be by the Jordan. You will measure from the northern border to the eastern sea. This will be the eastern side. Now, this is the beginning of allocating territories, because remember back in Genesis chapter 12, God said, I will bless those that bless you, to Abraham and his seed. And he said, and I will curse those that curse you. And then in chapter 15, he tells the land that he is going to allocate to Abraham's seed, which is the children of Jacob, which is all the Israelites. Now, what I want, and people will say that that's not going to happen, but God doesn't lie. And if you say it's not going to happen, you're making God a liar, or you're trying to. You're accusing him of being. You can't make him do anything, but you're accusing him of being a liar. So if God promised, and he did in Genesis 15, that the children of Jacob would have all this land allocated to them, and to this day they still have not. They have never, Israel, excuse me, never possessed all the land that God promised Abraham. But we're going to see when we get to Ezekiel 48 that they will, and it will be during the Millennial Reign. The south side, southward, will be from Tamar as far as the waters of the Meribeth Kadesh to the Wadi of Egypt and to the Great Sea. This will be the southern side toward the south. The west side will be the Great Sea, which is the Mediterranean. From the southern border as far as from the entrance of Hamath, this will be the western side. I think it's funny. Years ago, I saw an episode of Perry Stone when he was first going down to the southern portion of the Dead Sea in Israel on his tours, and I love when he does his tours in Israel. But he showed a sign at the south end of the Dead Sea, and it said the Dead Sea Fishing Club, and it was there's no fish in there, so but they had all these fresh water tanks with fish in them. Now, are those going to be some of the fish that get into the? I don't know. I don't know how, because they're at the south end. They're at the wrong end. But I do think it's interesting that if you remember when I showed you the picture of the divide that's separating the Dead Sea, it says that the fishermen shall set their nets from En-Gedi, which is the northern tip of the Dead Sea, to En-Glean. And En-Glean is actually right on the corner of that divide that is rising up out of the sea. So it is the En-Glean is the very southern end of where the fresh water will be, and that's what it says. They will spread their nets from there to there. It's almost like God knew what he was, the end from the beginning. I think it's very interesting. You are to divide this land yourselves to the tribes of Israel. So you are to divide it by lot for an inheritance for you and for the outsiders who will dwell among you. Whoever bears children among you, they will be to you like the native born of B'nai Israel, which is the sons of Israel. They will be allotted an inheritance along with you among the tribes of Israel. In whatever tribe the outsider lives, there you will give him his inheritance. It is a declaration of Adonai. Now we get into Ezekiel 48. Now this is where all the lands are being allocated. Now these are the names of the tribes. Now I want to point something out in a second. Dan's portion will be from the northern frontier beside the way of Hethron to the entrance of Hamath, Hazar, this is testing my Hebrew for sure, at the northern border of Damascus, beside Hamath, and from eastern side to the sea. Next to the territory of Dan, from the east side to the west, will be Asher. Next to the territory of Asher, from the east side to the west, will be Naphtali. Next to the territory of Naphtali, from the east side to the west, will be Manasseh, which is the oldest son of Joseph, that we talked about just a minute ago. He's mentioned in Revelation 7 and many other places. But next to the territory of Manasseh, from the east side to the west, is Ephraim. So there's the two we read earlier, that two allocations will be given to Joseph, but they will be divided. Ephraim was his second son, Joseph's second son. Next to the territory of Ephraim, from the east side to the west, will be Reuben, the oldest son of Jacob. Next to Ephraim, from the east side to the west, Reuben. Next to the territory of Reuben, from the east side to the west, will be Judah. Now, there's a lot in here. And at a quick glance, you don't see it. But if you look, the first one mentioned is Dan. Now, there's a couple of times in Scripture where Dan, not Dan himself, but his descendants, because if you look in Genesis chapter 49 and Deuteronomy chapter 33, you will see Genesis 49, there's a point when Jacob is prophesying over all his sons and giving them traits of what they will be like, their ancestors will be like. And in Deuteronomy 33, Moses does the same thing, but he only covers, I think it's 9 of the sons of Jacob, and gives allocations for personality traits. Now, one of the things of Dan, it says he shall always come from the behind the enemy. He will be a sneak attack. He will be a strategic fighter, we'll put it that way. And people will fear him. I mean, the enemies will fear him. But there are times in biblical history that Dan's descendants would worship other gods, and angered God to a point where he would take them out of the inheritance and out of the line of Jacob. But if you look, if you want to check it out, go to Revelation chapter 7, where it talks about the 12 tribes, and try and find Dan in it. He's not there, because God had stricken him from his ancestors. Will not be the 12,000. They will not have their own 12,000 of the 144. It will be Joseph and Manasseh, or Joseph and Ephraim. I'm not sure. But Dan is excluded from that. But this is after that. So at some point, Dan redeems himself, or he redeems his family, is probably more likely, because it doesn't really say that Dan did anything wrong. It just says that his family does, over and over again, his descendants. So at some point, Dan gets back into good graces with God and gets his allocation of land during the Millennial Reign. So I think all of that is interesting. And then we see Asher. The prophecy of his father Jacob over Asher was that he would dip his toe in oil at the time of the end, which is really interesting, because in Israel they have found the second largest oil shale deposit and the second largest natural gas deposit in the world, and it belongs to Israel. In Russia, that's why Russia is getting so nervous, because Russia's been supplying 100% of the natural gas into Europe, and Israel built now a pipeline to go under the Mediterranean Sea into Europe and to compete with Russia. And if that happens, will that be the hook in the jaw? Will it be natural gas? I tend to believe it might be also food, because Israel is the only nation on the planet that is able to take salt water and desalinate it and use it for crops and for drinking. And I think Israel will be, well, it's not think, it will be the stronghold for food in these tough times that are about to hit. So I think it's interesting that both those, the largest natural gas deposit and the largest oil shale, both reside in the territory allocated to Asher. And Jacob's prophesied over Asher that he would dip his toe in oil. Is that what he's talking about? I don't know. But I think it's interesting. Judah. We all know that that's the tribe that Jesus comes out of. By Judah's border, from the east to the west, will be the contribution, which will set aside 25,000 cubits in width and in length, like one of the portions from the east to the west. The sanctuary will be in the midst of it. The allotment that will be set apart to Adonai will be 25,000 in length and 10,000 in width. The holy allotment will be apportioned for these, the Kohanim. Kohanim, if you go all the way back to Numbers chapter 4, God tells Aaron to take the male's descendants from his son Cohen, and those between, they can't be a priest until they're 30 years old, and they can't become a priest after their 50th, after they turn 50. When they turn 51, they're barred from joining the priesthood. So you had to be between, he told Aaron to take the descendants of Cohen from the age of 30 to 50 and make them the priests over the temple. And like it says, that the Levites were allocated land, and the Kohen was a Levite. And so that land was allocated from in the territory of Judah, which I think is interesting. The priesthood, which Jesus became a priest, the high priest, is in the tribe that he came from. And as we discussed last time, John the Baptist transferred the priesthood into the tribe of Judah. The sanctuary portion will be for the Kohanim of the sons of Zadok, who kept my charge and did not go astray, as the Levites went astray when Bnei Israel went astray. Now, who is Zadok? Zadok was the high priest when David died. He was David's high priest in the tent of meeting, because David didn't have a tabernacle, but he put up animal skins just like they had on the Sinai, and they kept the Ark of the Covenant there, and he did have a high priest there. But when David died and Solomon took over, Zadok remained high priest while under Solomon until his death, and then his descendants. And that's what Jesus is saying. When Jesus takes the throne in the temple, he will make the descendants of Zadok the high priest of his temple. That's how much he respects Zadok, because Zadok stood strong even in all the things that David did wrong, all the things Solomon did wrong. Zadok was the rock. Okay, now I heard the number of those marked with the seal. Yeah, it's not Ezekiel 48. This is Revelation chapter 7. 144,000 from alongside the border of the Kohanim, the Levites will have 25,000 in length and 10,000 in width. The entire length will be 25,000 and the width 10,000. They must not sell or exchange any or transfer the choice portion of the land, for it is holy to Adonai. 5,000 that remain in the width, and the front of the 25,000 will be for common use, for the city and the living pasture. That's the Levites. Ezekiel 48, the city will be, these are verses 15 and 16, starting in 15. The city will be in the midst of it, and will have these measurements. I don't want to go through all the measurements, but anyway, the whole allotment will be 25,000 by 25,000 squared. You will set apart the holy allotment will be the property of the city. What is remaining from the side on the border of the holy allotment and the property will be for the prince. Now the prince, if we go back to where we started in Ezekiel 36 and 37, David is the prince. He will be the prince under Jesus forever. That's what it says. The holy allotment and the sanctuary of the house will be in the midst of it. The property of the Levites and the property of the city will be in the middle of what belongs to the prince. What belongs to the prince will be between Judah's border and Benjamin's border. As for the rest of the tribes, for the east and the west, he will be Benjamin's. Next to the territory of Benjamin from the east, it will be Simeon. Next to the territory of Simeon, east to west, is Issachar. Next to the territory of Issachar from the east to the west will be Zebulun. See, you can see that he is allocating and spreading out all this territory for the 12 tribes that he had promised Abraham 4,000 years ago. Now, God doesn't forget. To him, it's 4 days ago. I can remember 4 days. I don't know about 4,000 years, but I can remember 4 days. These are the exits of the city. To the north, 4,500 by measure, will be gates of the city named after the tribes of Israel. 3 gates northward. Reuben gate. As we talked about, there are many different kinds of gates, but there's the north, south, east, and west, and those are the gates by which people can enter and exit. These others have specific purposes. From that day on, the name of the city will be Adonai is there, which is very similar to what we see when we say Emmanuel, and it's God with us, because Adonai will be there. On that day, Adonai cut a covenant with Abraham. I give this land to your seed from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. So the Nile to the Euphrates. And then if you take all the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. We talked about some of those earlier. All of those, if you lay all those lands out, they take out the same territory as the Garden of Eden, which is 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles square, which is also the size of the city of the New Jerusalem that will descend from heaven, and I believe it'll sit. The New Jerusalem will sit in the land allocated to Abraham and his seed. So that culminates our discussion on Ezekiel. I hope that what we talked about helped, made a lot of sense, because we are definitely in that time, the time of the end, when Jesus one day soon will stand in a cloud and call to his people. Now, if you look at God is a God of tradition, you hear me say, or not tradition, of patterns, and he doesn't make mistakes. So when he acts in a certain way, every time he comes into that situation, he will act in that certain way. Now, if we look at how God spoke to Jesus audibly from heaven, we see a couple of incidents where he spoke, and it says the people who followed God, he says, my sheep know my voice. They heard his voice. When he said, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased, he said it twice. They understood it because they're his people. But it also said that then others heard what they thought were angels. Those are people who, what Jesus calls at the time of the end, lukewarm. They might believe in God, but they're not really followers of God. So they didn't recognize it as sheep following a shepherd. They recognized it as, oh, well, that was a beautiful sound. We believe it was angels. And then there's a third group where it says that group didn't know God at all, didn't believe in God, and it says, and they heard what they thought was thunder. So when Jesus stands in a cloud, that pattern will recreate itself. He will recreate that same pattern, and his sheep will hear his voice, and we will be drawn to the clouds. Those who are lukewarm, he said, I will vomit you out of my mouth. They will hear angels speaking, and they will not be called to the cloud because they won't know what's being said. Then you'll have those, unfortunately, billions, who don't know God and have no interest in God, that will be left behind with the lukewarm, but they won't even know that God spoke. They will think it was a thunderstorm. So what I'm really wanting to encourage, and you hear me say this quite often, is please consider that even if we're not at the time of the end, which I'm convinced we are, why wouldn't you want to follow Jesus? I don't want to think of this just as an escape, that we follow Jesus just so we don't have to be going through the tribulation, because that's not going to work. If that's the only reason you're doing it out of fear, fear is a wonderful motivator, but it's a terrible master. Because if you live in fear long enough, eventually you say, what am I afraid of? And you backslide. But if you follow Jesus because you want to love Jesus, that's a whole different game. That's, you love your family, you love your mother, you love your father. You are with them thick and thin if you love them. And in Jesus, if we love him, truly love him, we're with him no matter what the world says. Because the world, if we follow, you want to know whether it's of God or not? Just watch the news and see whether the world follows it. Because if the world says it's okay, then it's contrary to God. When a certain party says that these things are, God's okay with homosexuality, or God's okay with abortion, or God's okay, really? Because that's contrary to everything in Scripture. Everything. So if the world, and the world is on your side, the church is not, the true church is not, but the world is. So if the world is with you, what did Jesus say about that? If the world loves you, the love of God is not in you. So I am really encouraging you, and I really want, if you don't know Jesus, I am begging you to say, Lord Jesus, I believe that you are the Son of God. Say it with me if you haven't. And I believe that you came and died for my sins,